Hamstring Injury and Training Workshop, Module Hamstring Exercises Part 2. So the objectives of this module to gain knowledge and experience of how to carry out hamstring specific strengthening exercises for phases 3 to 5 and to learn how to apply these exercises into a progressive program. After observation of this presentation, you should then complete the guided practice for this module, details of which are on the learner management system. So phase 3 is focused on the second part of our general preparation, where we're looking at more single leg emphasis, correcting any bilateral strength differences by training one leg at a time, then looking at trying to increase the eccentric overload in order to continue to increase strength, and then looking at gradual progression into faster eccentric loading for phase 4, again working the hamstrings at both the hip and the knee joint. So the first set of exercises we'll look at are more single leg emphasis, where we're looking at the kneeling leg curl, the bodyweight bridge with a single leg eccentric phase, and the bench bridge, again loading the leg singly eccentrically. We're then looking at prone single leg isometric holds and oscillations, how we can do that in a couple of different ways. Split deadlift using dumbbells, split stance Romanian deadlift, and the single leg Romanian deadlift, and long stride lunges with more of a hamstring rather than a quadricep emphasis. We're also looking at our long stride walking lunges, again with a hamstring emphasis, transverse step up and triple jumper step up, and how we adapt the technique with those to emphasize more the hamstrings, and then sled bent over forward walks and backward walks. So first one we'll have a look at is the kneeling leg curl. So this is again single leg emphasis. So this is an isolation exercise. The torso is in a bent over position, which will lengthen the hamstrings. Significant amount of knee torque for this one, and variations where we can add plantar flexion on the eccentric phase, kind of how you've seen us do with the seated and prone leg curls. So here we see the kneeling leg curl in action. So single leg emphasis. So we kneel on one leg and then it's the other leg that's performing the actions. Here we see the right leg. The roller pad is just positioned at the bottom of the calf. And depending on the degree of hip flexion, we can kind of lengthen or shorten the hamstrings to add variation if we want to. Usually then just with these machines, just swivel the kneeling pad around to the other side. Same thing with the roller pad. And again, just repeat. So it's the same kind of isolated knee flexion, but in this case done in a standing / kneeling position. Now we can perform single leg emphasis work on the seated leg curl as well. So again, this is an isolation exercise, more of a distal hamstring emphasis. And the way that we adapt it for single leg eccentric emphasis, so you do both legs on the concentric phase. So as you're pulling the pad towards you, you use both legs. You then lift one leg off, and then you just perform the eccentric phase, the lengthening or the returning phase with just one leg at a time. You can do the whole set all on one leg, or you can swap legs between each repetition. Variations, obviously we can do the same thing with a prone leg curl as well. So here we see this in action. You perform the concentric phase then with both feet, and then lift one foot off and then just lower with the single leg. Now we want to usually adjust the weight so that it would be a little bit too tough, if you like, to perform both the concentric and eccentric. So we want to choose an appropriate weight, probably a little bit heavier than you would do just for a single leg seated leg curl, and that way we can increase the overload on the eccentric phase to get more strengthening. Now another single leg eccentric emphasis exercise, we can adapt the body weight bridge exercise that we did earlier. Again, a bit of an isolation exercise. So we do our standard short bridge on the concentric phase on the way up. Again, you then lift one leg off. In this case, we just extend it out in front. And then you lower the hips down towards the ground just on one leg. Again, we can do similar kind of variations, long bridging and bench bridging, or in the same thing. So again, here we see this in action. We bridge up with both legs, lift one leg off, and then lower just on that single leg. Again, you can alternate legs with each repetition, or you can do this whole set all on one leg to increase the overload on that particular side. Again, we want to do it nice, slow and controlled. And then here we see the bench bridging, again, being done. Same kind of technique. We bridge up with the shoulders on the bench, use both legs on the way up. You then lift one leg out, extend it out in front, and then lower the hips down towards the ground just on that one leg. Again, in this case, we're watching the whole set being performed all on one leg. You can alternate legs with each repetition. And then we're looking at single leg isometric holds and oscillations. So this is isometric action, so we're just kind of holding it for duration. Obviously, if we're just holding it, it's going to be working on the more the isometric strength. If we do these little oscillations, then we're going to be getting more of an elastic kind of neurological emphasis with that particular exercise. Large knee torque, and again, proximal and distal hamstring emphasis. So variations for this one, we can do it on a bench and on a Smith machine, as we see in the image on the background, or it can be done with a specific kind of back extension machine if you have one of those as well. So here we see it's the isometric holds, single leg being performed in a glute ham raise device. So you take one leg out and you're holding that horizontal position for duration. If we want to do little oscillations, we can do. Small, fast movements is what we're after. Again, just going from neutral downwards. Here we see the adaptation then if you don't have a glute ham device using a Smith machine. So we can do the back extension that we hold for duration, or we can do small oscillations, and again we can do these single leg or both legs if we wish. So a single leg, as we see there, just holding it for duration. And then oscillations, as we saw with the previous video, you just oscillate from that top position. And the next exercise, we're looking at split deadlift using the dumbbells. So this is the compound exercise, both on the isometric and eccentric emphasis on the hamstrings, heavy on the hip torque. Feet, you want slightly further apart than you would do for a single leg Romanian deadlifts, as it will help you with greater sacroiliac joint stability. So variations then, we can do more of a split Romanian deadlift or a single leg Romanian deadlift, which we'll show you in some of the videos in a second. But with this split deadlift, yeah, we're actually trying to split the load and the weight distribution kind of equally between both feet rather than being it all on the front leg. So here we see the split deadlift performed from the side. So effectively, it's a few different phases. We go with this wide staggered or split stance. Weight is kind of distributed between both feet. We then do like a deadlift movement and then squatting down, maintaining that torso angle. Then push back up and then stand up from the hips. So it's very much hips move first, and then we squat down, squat back up, and then stand up from the hips. And as you see here, we want to have a slightly wider stance. Gives us a bit more sacroiliac joint stability. So hips bend over first, then squatting down, keeping that torso angle, and pushing back up, and then standing up. So it's kind of like 4 different phases. So here we see the different stances between the exercise we just showed you, the split stance deadlift, and the exercise we'll show you in a second, the split stance Romanian deadlift. So with the split stance deadlift, we tend to keep the weight split between both legs, and this wider stance gives us greater SIJ stability. It also helps us to recruit a little bit more on the adductors as well. When we do the split stance Romanian deadlift, the weight is distributed mostly on the front leg. The rear foot is just kind of touching the ground for more balance rather than actual force production. Now here you see the main difference with a split stance Romanian deadlift, and that all the weight distribution is really over that front leg. So the dumbbells in this case are getting lowered a little bit further forward than they were with the previous one. The rear foot in this case is just being used for balance, which helps us lift a little bit more weight than when we do a single leg Romanian deadlift, and the rear foot is actually off the ground. So it just provides a little bit more stability. And here we see the single leg Romanian deadlift being performed, in this case with a dumbbell, also referred to as a kind of arabesque deadlift. You can hold the load in both hands, in this case holding it just in the opposite hand, keeping that leg on the straighter side, definitely kind of limiting the knee bend, and then we're lowering that load towards the ground. You do tend to find you're probably going to lift slightly less weight than with the previous exercise, just because you need to use a little bit more energy for balance. So the next exercise we'll look at is our long stride or hamstring focused lunges. It's a compound exercise, so very much in the kind of squat movement pattern, but again we're going to be focused on working our hamstrings as primarily hip extensors here. Big tweaks that we do is an exaggerated stride, so we're going to take a much longer stride than maybe you would do normally. So the foot is going to be further forward, just so much that the foot is either kind of beneath the knee or even slightly further in front of the knee. And this exaggerated stride helps us to favour the hamstrings more so than the kind of the quadriceps. The other thing that we're going to do is when we kind of do these lunges in place, is we're going to focus, rather than pushing back to the start position, which is what you normally do with a lunge in place, we're going to focus on actually kind of stepping forward and bring the whole torso forward over the kind of lead foot. And that hip extension is going to propel the body forwards, rather than kind of using the knee extension, like we said, to push the body backwards, back towards the rear foot. It's very good for building the biceps femoris cross-sectional area, and that's one of the main reasons why we tend to use this one. So here we see this being performed. Then we take a long stride, and then we do a strong hip extension with that lead leg in order to propel the body forwards. Take a couple of steps back and repeat. So you're trying to keep your torso nice and upright as well. So you imagine it's kind of like a lunge version of doing like a kind of running action. That's what we're after. So the big error that we tend to see with this one is kind of leaning the body forward and trying to shift all the weight forward to try to make it easier. We want to try to keep the torso upright, the stride long, and that'll mean that we really hit the hamstrings. So here we see the difference between the kind of quad version on the kind of left hand side and the hamstring version on the right hand side. Now this can then also be applied into kind of walking lunges. So if you've got enough space to have distance and actually kind of do it as a continuous walking motion, we can do it like that. Here we're just showing it with you with kind of body weight, but obviously we can do it resisted with kind of dumbbells. And again, his torso is upright throughout, long strides, and we're trying to really focus on that strong hip extension on the lead leg in order to pull and propel the body forwards. Now if we're looking at step up adaptations, transverse step up is a good one. This is a compound exercise, obviously. It's a squat movement pattern. Obviously we have to control these additional transverse forces, and what you're going to find is there's going to be an increased adductor magnus activation. The reason there's more adductor magnus activations, if you look where the body is in the background with that image, the thigh or the femur is abducted out to the side. So really, to lift the torso and the body upwards, it's the adduction that helps to perform that. It's also hip extension. Again, if we can kind of keep the knee over the foot so we don't utilize too much quadriceps. So as an isometric hamstring action, you're going to get concurrent knee extension plus hip extension. And the other variation, which is good for for hamstrings, is going to be our lateral step up as well. So here we see the transverse step up. So generally we kind of start with the knee roughly about kind of hip height. You don't want to go too deep for this one, but you can do with other step up variations. So we have a hip extension and an adduction going on at the hip joint. So we're going to be using the hamstrings and the adductors predominantly. You want to limit the weight shift over that foot and try to really focus on using the hamstrings and the hip extension to lift the body up and over onto the step. Now the triple jumper step up, and there's a variety of variations we can kind of do to kind of play around with this one as well. So this is the compound exercise. Again, it's a squat movement pattern, and in essence this is a deep single leg squat / step up. So we are going to be getting a lot of quadricep emphasis. So this kind of seems to go against what I said previously, which is you want to try to keep the knee back and not have the kind of knee too far forward, which tends to emphasize more quadriceps. The reason we can kind of do this variation is for, again, adductor magnus activation. So when you're in this deep single leg squat position, you are going to find there's going to be a lot of adductor activation just for stabilization. Again, we're going to get isometric hamstring action, that concurrent knee extension plus hip extension. So here we see this in action then. We are trying to set the step nice and high, so we're starting from a deep squat position. You can use the other foot for a little bit of assistance initially. Even kind of doing isometric holds at the bottom. These are one of the kind of variations we use when we're teaching people how to do pistol squats. And again, when you're in this deep squat position, you'll find you're going to get a lot of adductor activation just for stabilization in this position. So a lot of people will say only really go up to 90 degrees, so knee is level with the thigh. There is no reason why you can't go higher as long as you can maintain a good technique whilst you're performing the exercise. Again, looking at the functional application, here we have these kind of bent over forward walks. Again, this is done at a slow velocity, it's loaded hip extension. So again, we're looking at kind of concentric hamstring function with this exercise. So you need a kind of straps to hold on to with this one. You attach it to the sled and then getting into a kind of like a bent over position, so kind of torso almost parallel with the ground or horizontal. We're then walking in this bent over position. So bending over helps us to kind of put more emphasis on the hamstrings. Here we see it side on. And you can do it a little quicker. And even if we kind of load it up, the idea is you're trying to move yourself faster. So you're not deliberately trying to move slowly, but just the position means that it ends up being a kind of slower exercise than what we've seen with the previous ones. So here we see sled backward walks. Again, this is a nice way of getting the hamstrings to produce force in a relatively functional pattern, if you like. So kind of resisted backwards walking. Obviously, you can do this with a kind of cable machine and you usually get a few steps out of it, and so a sled is preferable. Obviously, a lot of facilities don't necessarily have sleds or enough space to kind of do these kind of longer distance resisted walking, in which case something like a cable machine may be a nice way of getting around that problem. But if we do have the space and the equipment to do it, then we would generally recommend you kind of do it with a heavy sled. So the second load that we'll show you on more kind of eccentric emphasis. And again, some of these are more single leg as well, but we're looking at trying to add a little bit more eccentric loading. So we can do eccentric accentuated back extensions and Romanian deadlifts on the eccentric phase with a concentric deadlift on the upward phase. We can do eccentric split stance Romanian deadlifts, and then again add a little bit more speed, reverse step and reach or forward step and reach. I'll show you a kettlebell powerbomb swing and also long split squats with oscillations. So we saw the kind of isometric back extensions earlier. We can do more eccentric accentuated back extensions. Again, we can use a glute ham device or other machines. So again, it's an isolation exercise, heavy on the hip and knee torque. The way that we overload the eccentric phase with this one is we can kind of adjust the arm position. So in this case, we would, as we're kind of doing the lifting phase, put our arms in an easier position, so less load, and then we adjust the arms into a harder position when we're at the top, and then lower with additional loading. And again, we could do this with a weight plate if you want to play around with that as well, but initially just playing around with the arm position will allow us to increase or decrease the load depending on whether we're doing the eccentric or concentric phases. So here we see this in action. So we're going to do the lowering phase with the fingers on the temples, so more load at the bottom, put the arms across the chest to make it easier on the way up, and we just keep on swapping the arm position at the top and at the bottom. We can also do this with a weight plate, heavier on the way down there, place it on the chest for the way up to make it easier, and repeat. So adapting some of the exercises that a lot of people will do in the gym for more eccentric overload. So we can do a eccentric Romanian deadlift, and then the concentric phase on the ascent, we use our quads a little bit more. So we do what we refer to as a standard deadlift. So again, compound exercise, heavy on the hip torque. So this allows for a much greater overload on the lowering phase. So we do our Romanian deadlift for the eccentric or lowering phase where we're weaker. Then you bring the knees forward, bring the quads into it when the bar's on the ground, and then you do a standard deadlift on the concentric phase on the way up where we're stronger. So you might be able to do, I don't know, a normal Romanian deadlift with, let's say, 60 kilos. What we can do here is we can increase the load because you're always going to be stronger on that eccentric phase. So we might do 70, 75, even 80 kilos. Lower that using the Romanian deadlift technique, and then use our standard deadlift technique on the way up. So here we see this in action. And again, we can use, usually a kind of a bar helps us to load this up with a reasonable amount of weight. So we do our strict Romanian deadlift on the way down till the bar's on the ground. Then we bring our knees forward, use our quads to help us on the way up. Can be done, say, with a standard barbell. We're just using this bar. It's a little bit of variation. So Romanian deadlift, eccentric on the way down, bring the knees forward, and then concentric is just a standard deadlift technique. Now we can apply the same methodology of overloading the lowering phase with rather than kind of bringing the quads into it. In this case, we do single leg and then double leg. So again, all the same kind of attributes, compound exercise, heavy on the hip torque, and again, allowing for greater overload on the eccentric or lowering phase. So again, where we're weaker, we can overload those muscles with a split stance. So we do a split stance on the way down on the lowering phase, put the bar on the ground, then we step forward with the other leg, do a parallel stance, Romanian deadlift on the way up, and then again, step back and just lower on one leg. Now we can again do the whole set on one leg, or we can change legs with each repetition. And if you want a variation, you can do this again as like a step and reach to concentric single leg Romanian deadlift. So here we see the split stance to standard Romanian deadlift. So we start in a split stance, all the emphasis then on that lead left leg, lower the bar down to the ground, step forward, come up with two legs, step back again, and repeat. Try to keep the emphasis on that lead leg as well. We're trying to do this as a split Romanian deadlift rather than a split deadlift, where we distribute the weight more between both legs. So this is, like I said, one of the variations. We can do the step and reach, and then rather than doing a big push back, we just do a standard single leg Romanian deadlift. So you do the step and reach, more load, and then you just slowly stand up, reset into the start position and go again. So we don't need to worry about producing as much force to get the big push back to bring the lead leg in line with the rear foot. In this case, we just do a slower. So we're going to need more force, or there's more force being produced on the eccentric phase because of this additional ground reaction forces with the step. And then we're moving on to our step and reach. We've referred to them as a step and reach. They are effectively like a dynamic split stance Romanian deadlift. So they're kind of like the lunge equivalent in this case for the lift pattern. So a compound exercise, again, what we use these for is training hamstrings, but more for deceleration. So again, as we mentioned in the previous presentations, the ability for the hamstring to kind of decelerate the torso is a key thing in helping to look at injury prevention. It's also known as like a good morning reverse step to split stance. Heavy on the hip torque and obviously heavy on the eccentric and decelerating component. So here we see this in action. So once you can do a split stance Romanian deadlift, this is one way to kind of increase the overload. Effectively, you do a small step backwards and lower the torso down to horizontal with more speed. The emphasis, the weight distribution, again, should all be on the front leg. The rear foot is predominantly just for balance. So this is, it's like a step back, dynamically moving down into that split stance Romanian deadlift. As you see here, in this case, we're holding a plate across the chest, so more of a kind of Zerker position, but you can hold loads, whether it's barbells, dumbbells, etc., in a variety of different positions. So that was the reverse step and reach. The step and reach, again, is a compound exercise, again, training hamstrings for deceleration. We can also refer to it like a good morning step into split stance. So what's the difference between this one and the previous one? Well, with this one, we're actually stepping forward into it. So we're going to get additional ground reaction forces. That's what that shorthand means. So more ground reaction forces. So as you step forward and your foot hits the ground, the force that comes back from the floor is going to be more than the previous version because the leg we were training actually didn't move from its position. So we're going to get more ground reaction force than we did with the previous reverse step and reach. And again, it's going to be heavy on the hip torque. So here we see the step and reach, or the Zerker good morning, being performed. Lots of different names for these, we just call it a step and reach, so it's easier. So it's a step forward, about a third of the distance that you would for a lunge. And then as you step, the torso is leaning forward into that Romanian deadlift position. Again, we're trying to limit the knee bend. So we kind of coach this, imagine you're stepping up to a small fence and then almost kind of reaching over with your torso. So the end position should be that same split stance Romanian deadlift. We're just doing it at a greater velocity than we were with our our slower tempo exercises. So the way that we can adapt the swing to add more eccentric loading is doing what we call a power bomb version, in which case with this one you need a partner. So it's a compound exercise. Obviously we're looking at hip extension movement. It's a large hip torque again. And what we're looking at here is we're going to increase the eccentric overload with the partner actually kind of pushing or kind of throwing the kettlebell downwards. So the individual swinging the kettlebell kind of swings it upwards as normal. The partner is stood in front, and you need someone that's trained to be able to do this. The partner stood in front, they place their hands kind of on top of the kettlebell as it gets towards the top of the swing, and then they push down aggressively, which adds more eccentric loading on the downwards or eccentric phase. So this is a good one. It increases the eccentric overload without just lifting a heavier kettlebell, which would increase both phases. Key things, again, like we kind of said earlier with the kettlebell, you must have completed an advanced kettlebell workshop where you've actually been taught how to do this exercise before you'd want to apply it with your client base. So here we see us in action, these kind of power bomb swings. So the individual has their kettlebell. Like I said, normally most people just go with lifting heavier and heavier kettlebells. So how this works is you're going to just add more force on the eccentric phase. So the partner places their hands in the right position. You need to make sure you're in the right position so you don't get hit in the face. And then you're really going to push down and add more load to the eccentric phase of the swing exercise. Surprisingly challenging for the guy swinging the kettlebell, pretty easy for the one pushing down on it, the partner. So this does take some training to be able to do it. You want to make sure you've, like I say, been taught all the key aspects of where to stand and how to actually do it on the timing side before you start to integrate it with your client base. And then we're looking at how we can tweak the technique for some of our kind of standard exercises to get a little bit more hamstring emphasis. So here we have a split stance squat. In this case, we're going for a long split stance. If you want more quad emphasis, you tend to go with a kind of slightly shorter stance. The knee will go a little bit further forward. In this case, we want the foot in front of that knee because we are deliberately trying to get more hamstring overload. So this is a compound exercise. With the oscillations, we're going to get more of a reactive overload. So again, heavy on the hip torque, and the longer step, as we said, will help to emphasize the hamstrings rather than a shorter step, which is going to be more of a quad emphasis, lunge or split squat. So variations, we can do these with walking lunges, you can do these with oscillations, or we can kind of do walking hamstring lunges with oscillations and combine those two variations together. So here we see the long split squat with oscillation. So nice long stance, and we're just literally doing a little dip down and up quick as you can to get more of a reactive and neurological overload. But yeah, the trick with this one is you need to have that front foot in front of the knee. If it's too far back, it's too short a stride, then you really start hitting more the quads. So we'll take a break there. When you're ready, move on to the second presentation, which will go through the rest of the content for this module.